All right. So we're doing Depth Psychology in the New Ethic by Erich. Is it Neumann or Neumann?
I don't know. I used to pronounce Newman all my life, and then I went to a workshop once, and the guy there said Neumann. So
Yeah.
I guess I don't know. If you're Christian, you call him Newman. If you're Jewish, you call him Neumann. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I've always said Neumann, but I think I heard Jordan Peterson in a lecture call him Newman. And then you made the Seinfeld joke. You were like, oh yeah, Newman, like Seinfeld.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I think it's kind of like the Jung or Jung debate. You know, there's some people who say Carl Jung, others say Jung.
Van Wyck and White, tomato.
Exactly. But anyways, so yeah, we're doing this book, this essay, and this was one of his first pieces I was reading. I guess it maybe wasn't the first that he wrote, but it was the first that was published.
Yeah. Yep.
And
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. He tries to tackle a pretty big undertaking. You know, it's interesting with just a lot of writers. It's like their first piece is kind of their opportunity to just like, you know, get it all out. So it's a pretty ambitious piece. You know, he's trying to kind of set up a new ethic and kind of critique the old ethic, which we'll kind of get into what that is and what that looks like. But yeah, he deals with the problem of evil. He gets into projection and scapegoat psychology, which we'll get into all that good stuff. But maybe before we jump into it, you know, this book's called Depth Psychology in the New Ethic. And maybe we can maybe just start with depth psychology. So what is your, and it's kind of a broad question, but what is kind of your like working definition of depth psychology and what that is? Like if somebody had never heard of depth psychology, like what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, depth psychology, it's another term for psychodynamic. Depth psychology is that area of psychology that entertains the proposition that there's an unconscious, and it's primary. It precedes consciousness, and it's a term that was coined by Carl Jung's supervisor in Zurich at the Bergolzo Clinic, Eugene Bleuler, Bleuler. You got to I apologize. I mispronounced all these German names.
Yeah.
But Eugene Bleuler was Carl Jung's supervisor, and when Jung was developing, his stuff, Eugene, in order to contrast his, students' new work from Freud's, because Freud was the man, he said, let's call this depth psychology. Subsequently, it was called analytical psychology by Jung's followers, but it was Bleuler's term. He coined a lot of terms like schizophrenia and other terms.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting history. Anyway, depth psychology was coined by Bleuler, and it proposes that the psyche is predominantly unconscious. It accepts the proposition that the unconscious, particularly the deeper layers, the collective unconscious. Yeah. So I hope I responded to your question.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I mean, yeah, a lot of what Neumann or Newman gets into is talking about how now that we, here in the 20th century when this was written, like now that we know about and accept that there is an unconscious, this makes us kind of have to rethink ethics in general. So it is kind of, a pivotal part of this piece as well.
Yep.
Is understanding that we have this thing called the unconscious and it is governing a lot of our behavior, or maybe even most of our behavior.
Yep. The new ethic implies a relationship with the unconscious. The old ethic employs, as it says later on, we're going to get into it, employs certain strategies like suppression and repression. And one of the things that it represses and has suppressed as well is the unconscious. it doesn't recognize it. It doesn't have a relationship with it. It only focuses on what's called what we call now materialism. You know, back then they used to use the word physicalism.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, cool. Well, maybe because he kind of divides this essay up into a few different sections. And after the introduction, the first, kind of real section is called The Old Ethic. So maybe we can start there and kind of break down what Neumann thinks the old ethic is, meaning the way that societies have kind of created ethics up until this point.
Sure, you can start with the old ethic because the chapter 1 on introduction.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, that first sentence, I think it's key. I don't know what copy you have on page 25.
Mm-hmm.
That first sentence, I think it's key. The problem of evil is one of the most central problems of modern man. That sentence. I mean, it's a simple sentence, and then that second paragraph, I think it's also critical. The modern age is an epoch in human history in which science and technology are demonstrating beyond doubt the capacity of the conscious mind to deal with physical nature and to master it to a very large extent. That's an important statement regarding the old ethic. So again, it's right that it's, you can infer that it's dismissing the unconscious right there. At any rate, to a greater degree than in any earlier period in human history. But it is also an epoch in which man's incapacity, it's incapable to deal with psychic nature. So again, this other aspect of psyche, which is the unconscious, another area. You asked me earlier on regarding depth psychology. Depth psychology sometimes is also known as spiritual psychology. The unconscious. In order for one to have a spiritual experience, one needs to encounter the unconscious, particularly the deeper layers, the archetypal layers, according to analytical psychology. And here he says, in which man's incapacity to deal with psychic nature. So man can only deal with materialistic nature, conscious nature, not with psychic nature. He denies that. I hope that makes some sort of sense. With the human soul, or the next clause says it, with the human soul has become more appallingly obvious than ever before. So there's a maintenance of a split between man's psychic nature, which is both conscious and unconscious. So the reason I read that, because I think that's an important idea to grapple with or to chew on before we get into the dual ethic. So it's like I think Neumann in this introduction is laying out a map, and that's what I like about Neumann. He's developing his argument, but simultaneously he's sustaining Jungian thought. Because that's his foundation. It is Jungian, it's analytical psychology. I hope that makes some sort of sense.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, this introduction, I think it is important, and I wasn't trying to skip over it. I think this piece is written kind of in the wake of World War II. So some of what he's saying in this introduction too is just like, we've seen humans' capacity for evil. Yep. And we can't really ignore that anymore. And and then he kind of goes on to say, which is a lot of the thesis of this piece, that a lot of that evil comes from our inability to it comes from the fact that we repress all of these elements of ourselves, and then it comes out in different ways like projection, and we'll get into all of that as well later.
Okay. I'm sorry, we don't have to go there. We could go straight to chapter 2.
No. It's great. It's great. I was just thinking it might be hard to get into talking about that until we've kind of have a foundation of what the old ethic is, and kind of how he thinks about kind of what has happened.
Okay.
And as far as the old ethic goes, he says a lot of it has its roots in the kind of Judeo-Christian tradition and the Greek tradition.
Yep.
And it's what happens, he says, is there's this kind of split where we tend to separate good and evil and darkness and light into two things. And maybe the extreme version of this would be like, God and the devil, with God being perfection and the ideal and light, and the devil being darkness. And, so the old ethic, I think from what I gathered, what the old ethic tries to do is divide these two things and say, this is good, this is bad, and we should strive for the good, and we should try to get rid of the bad or push the bad away.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that kind of how you read what he's trying to say with the old ethic as well?
Yeah. I think I don't remember where, but explicitly he states that the old ethic is dualistic. I think it's in that. I wrote it down somewhere. Here it goes. It's on page 44. The old ethic is dualistic. It's towards the bottom paragraph. But you kind of could infer that as you're reading the material. So the old ethic is dualistic. So like you said, and what he says, he divides the pure with the impure. It divides light and dark. And again, you start getting these Iranian ideas. These Zoroastrian ideas, which ultimately begins to influence the Near East, where Christianity emerges and where the Hellenistic culture, it comes together. So, so there is this and that. There's this or that, good or evil, and then there's a tendency in that dualistic approach to deny that which is perceived by the collective as negative. And he does make a point that's never that's not categorical, because in what's positive in one group may be negative in another group. But the point still is that it's dualistic, and no matter what the collective is, you have the collective values, and you have what he calls the anti collective values, or the anti-values. And those anti-values, whatever those particular arbitrary detailed facts are, they are denied. So there's a dualistic, that which you accept and that which you don't accept. And that which you don't accept is what Jung and Neumann calls the shadow, what's called darkness.
Right. Well, and that's a good point too, to bring up that, good, what we call good and evil, is not, at least in Neumann's view, it's not this objective thing. It's kind of subjective, depending on what the collective or what the society deems as being good and evil. So, in one time or one period in history, something like courage might be considered, a good, and cowardice would be considered an evil. Maybe that's not a good example, because I'm having trouble thinking of maybe a culture where that's courage is not considered a good. But
no, but you illustrate the point. You make the point. Maybe you may not want to say courage, but you can develop that argument. Or maybe you want to talk about marriage. Maybe in one culture you can only marry one person, and then the implication is what is fidelity. In another culture, you're allowed to marry more than one person. Mm-hmm. In one culture, you're allowed to eat pork. In another culture, you're not allowed to eat pork. There's an anti-value, what he calls a prohibition. And like you said, one of the key contingency is time and place. He repeats that over and over again. It's always contingent, like in terms of context, time and place. What's considered value in this place and time or this epoch may not be, maybe considered an anti-value in another place, in another epoch. So it a lot depends on contingencies. In one group, tall people are value, in another group, short people are value. So it's wonderful. It makes you think of these narratives, these stories of Gulliver's travels and stuff like that. How values change, because a lot what Neumann talks about and what Jung talks about are illustrated in stories. You know, what's that story about Dorothy, the Wizard of Oz? You know, how values change from one context to another context. So yeah, what you're saying is true. Time and place is very important with regards to what is collectively a value.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important to bring that up early because when he uses something like the word evil, he's using evil in the context of it is evil within that society or within that collective.
Yep.
So, and you know, we'll kind of probably get into that later where he says people like Jesus or Socrates or Martin Luther, you know, they were kind of considered, in a sense, doing some evil things because what they were doing and what they were thinking was not what was accepted in the society at the time. They were kind of, you know, groundbreakers.
He calls them revolutionary, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's the term he uses. You know, he also uses the word radical. You got to be a radical thinker. You got to be a revolutionary thinker. The risk with that within the old ethics is that you're perceived as what? You're perceived as evil. If you're radical or if you're revolutionary within the old ethics, within the dualistic old ethic, you run the risk of being perceived by the group, by the collective mentality as evil, as a renegade.
Absolutely.
Therefore, you'll be crucified like a Jesus.
Absolutely.
So you're absolutely right. Well, I agree with you. That's what Norman's trying to say.
Yeah. So he says, you know, we've had this old ethic, and some of the ways that the ethic is able to function is, you know, we kind of cultivate it by doing a few different things. And he talks a little bit about like suppression and repression.
Yep.
Which I've got to admit, I think in the past I've been guilty of kind of conflating those terms, but he does a good job here of kind of like distinguishing the two. So he says suppression is a conscious act. This is where you are consciously deciding to maybe suppress something like an urge that you feel. So maybe in this instance, we use like courage as an example. So maybe your urge is to run away and cower away, and you suppress that urge and you know, stay on the battle line and you fight. So that maybe would be an example of suppression, where it's just like it's a conscious act. You know, the value in the culture, maybe say this culture, the value is to be courageous and to fight and be a warrior. So I'm going to maybe suppress this kind of cowardly urge inside of me, and I'm going to, you know, fight with my brethren on the battlefield or something like that.
Yeah. I don't like, I mean, there's certainly a distinction between suppression and repression. But I remember, you know, I reread it today. One of the reasons I reread it because, you know, you gave me a list of terms, and those were two of the terms. And I don't like how Neumann describes it, suppression. You know, maybe it's because I don't understand the way he's describing it. So that could be it. But you said it. One of the contrasts, a significant contrast between suppression and repression is that suppression, you are conscious of what you are deceiving yourself of, what you're denying. You're intentionally deceiving yourself for whatever the motives may be, but you're conscious of it. So parents may suppress information from their children. So maybe, you know, there were these skeletons in the closet. So a family will not talk about those skeletons, like a grandfather who is not courageous. So they don't talk about his lack of courage, but they do talk about other characteristics of him. So there is this intent. But as George and as Zachary, as grandkids of, you know, of this family, we experience a sense of hypocrisy, right? There's something going on. We can't put our finger on it. We feel there's anxiety. We cannot, because of the power that our parents and grandparents have over us, we cannot call them liars. But we feel the what other people call the double bind. You know, there's double messages. There's this hypocrisy. We know there's a deception going on. That is suppression. You know, when there's an intentional, a conscious attempt to deceive others,
Mm.
no matter what the particulars are, courage,
Yeah.
or other stuff, as opposed to repression. Repression is totally you're unconscious of it.
Right.
There's denial to the extreme. There is no recognition. There is no intent of deception. You consciously have. I think he calls it that there's a forgetfulness. I forget what he calls it. There's some sort of you forget about it, particularly after generations, right? It's just forgotten about. It's completely unconscious. So the suppression has to do with an element of consciousness. It's done intentionally to deceive. Repression is done unintentionally. But I think the very important point, and he later on makes it, he says they're both dangerous, but the really dangerous one, and that's when he gets into scapegoat psychology.
Yeah.
The really dangerous one is repression.
Right.
Because it's through repression we begin to employ projection.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Projection is projection of unconscious content, and unconscious content is repressed content, not suppressed content.
Right. Absolutely. And I thought it was interesting reading about, kind of how Neumann defined repression. Like, it holds up a lot with kind of what we know about cognitive biases now. And there's something called like the self-serving bias, which one of the kind of aspects of the self-serving bias is that we tend to remember memories from our past where we look good, or like that kind of paint us in a good light. And we tend to forget things from our past where we tend to kind of not look so good. So this could be something where it's like, I'm just kind of reflecting on like, am I a courageous person? And the things that come to mind were the times that I acted courageously. And I kind of conveniently forget all the times where I act like a coward. And again, it's happening at the unconscious level. So it's not like I'm consciously deciding to remember these things or not. It's just, they're just not available. I've kind of repressed that.
That's pretty cool what you just did. Yeah, it's cool when you. I think what you just did. I don't know if you did it intentionally, but for me, it looks like you did it. You got comparative. You start using depth psychology with other psychologists. In this case, social psych. I mean, these terms, cognitive dissonance, self-serving bias. These are terms that are employed in social psych. Right. They're all pointing to the same phenomenon. How we deceive ourselves when we interact with other subjects in a group. So for example, I have 20 girlfriends, and I only tell you about the ones I've been successful with. I don't tell you the ones that I've been unsuccessful with. And so you have a perception of me that's inaccurate. That's somewhat deceitful. According to depth psychologists, I am going to experience a measure of neurosis because of my suppression. Now, you either agree with that or you don't. A lot depends on ego inflation. We can get into that later. But usually, most of us experience a measure of neurosis depending how we participate in the suppression and repression of psychic material. Yeah. In this case, truth. The truth. In this case, in particular, the truth that we are the source of evil.
Totally. So
how do you admit that?
Yeah. So I think we should definitely get into some of the negative effects of the suppression, repression. But maybe just one more thing before we move on. I think one of the things he brought up, and this actually might have been in one of the other authors' kind of intros to the book or forwards to the book, was the reason that we repress things is because it is kind of damaging to our ego, or it's damaging to our self-esteem. And that, like, our self-image, if we maybe saw ourselves as we truly are in all the complexity of it, and maybe saw ourselves as, okay, I actually am a bit of a coward, or I actually am pretty selfish, or I actually am pretty envious. That's kind of a blow to the ego. That's kind of damaging to our self-image, damaging to our self-esteem. So I think that's one of the reasons that we tend to repress. And that's another thing. So talking about cognitive biases in social psychology, I think it's the optimism bias. There's something actually, I think it's from this book, Stumbling on Happiness. The author's name is blanking at the moment, but he talks about how basically if we saw ourselves exactly the way we are, like if our picture of ourselves was exactly accurate, it's likely that we would be depressed. And on the other hand, if we just completely had an inflated image of ourselves, like that was out of control, it would be dangerous. You know, we would start thinking like, oh, you know, I can beat up that guy and, you know, get our ass kicked or whatever. So he says maybe like evolutionarily it worked out so that we have a little bit of a delusion when it comes to how good we are at certain things or how virtuous we are, but it's not to the point where it's out of control.
I mean, there are different levels. I'll give you an example for an innocuous, you know, a harmless example. So let's say I'm your psychology professor and you fail all 5 exams I gave you. Well, my perception is that you suck. You don't know how to study, Zach.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You got to be, you need to read the book much more. Another plausible explanation can mean I suck. I don't know how to teach the material. I'm going to prefer the former description. You're the idiot, not me, right? So, you know, that's self-serving. You know, that is a form of, now, I'll leave it up to you to decide if that's suppression or repression. You can argue both. So, you know, what is it? Which characteristic of myself am I self-serving? You know, and that ultimately leads to a cognitive dissonance. Because even though I tell you, you suck, and I'm the great teacher, but you're a mediocre student, I'm going to experience at some level a neurosis. And now I need to express that. I need to vent that neurosis. Well, one of the ways for me to vent that neurosis is I go home and kick my dog. You know, I can't kick you. I can only call you a below par student, you know, and give you a C, not, you know, not the potential A that you have within you, because I cannot accept the mediocrity within myself. So I project it onto you in some form, and I displace it somewhere else. In any case, they're both dangerous, aren't they?
Yeah.
You know, the dangerous. I hope that illustrates the point. How we all participate in this kind of stuff, in this type of deception, you know. But it gets quite dangerous when we get what he called later on. When we get into the scapegoat psychology, and that's when we start seeing a lot of victims, you know. But that happens at a collective level, right? Right now, I was just giving an example of what happens at an interpersonal level between you and I, you know. It can get worse, right? Particularly if I start making policy and saying that students who only perform at the C level, we got to put them in concentration camps. You know, it gets quite nefarious at that point.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. That like a lot of what Neumann's talking about, it works at an individual level and it works at a collective level as well. So these things like suppression and repression, you know, we've kind of been talking about them on the individual level, but you know, the collective can repress certain things as well, when the collective can suppress certain things as well. Well, cool. So we've been kind of hinting around like scapegoat psychology, and maybe we can kind of get into what that is and how he thinks about it. So we were kind of talking about suppression and repression as the way that society, or, you know, individuals in a society try to meet this, you know, ideal or perfection that they're striving towards. And he says what tends to happen with repression is the individual splits, they split into 2 different kind of their psyche, they kind of split into two different sides. You have the persona and the shadow.
Right.
And the persona is at my understanding, the persona is what is accepted by society, what is it's kind of the individual's, the part of the individual that allows them to interface with society and contains all of the quote unquote good elements, the things that society would, the courageous aspect of the personality and the virtuous aspect of the personality. And then the shadow tends to be the opposite of that. So this is either the darker sides of the personality or just the sides of the personality that would not be looked at favorably by the collective. So maybe the cowardice aspect of the person, the selfish aspect of the person. And
well, it's correct. Yeah. The cowardice aspect of the person as it's perceived by the collective. But the person can be quite heroic, but it's perceived by the collective values as being a coward. So the persona embodies the collective values. And textual, it's time and place. And the shadow are the what he calls the anti-values, that which is not accepted. So within a context, it's perceived as anti-values. It's those aspects that the society, the collective values do not want to accept. They prefer to forget vis-a-vis suppression and repression. So there's a maintenance. So suppression and repression maintains the old ethic, which is really interesting stuff. It sounds simple, but I don't know for you, but as I read this material, I just have to sit down with my espresso and think. The implications of this is scary, because I find that this depth psychology and new ethic not only descriptive of what Neumann was experiencing, but I find it highly descriptive of what's going on today.
Yeah.
In my own family, in my own neighborhood, in Brooklyn, in Queens, in this country, in this world, I find that we are starving. We need a new ethic. The new ethic seems like it's ready. I don't know about you, but I feel like it's ready to percolate. But for some reason, we still have this lingering attachment to the dual ethic. Well, what are the implications? Well, that we're still regressing, we're still repressing, we're still suppressing, we're still participating in this, what he calls infantile strategies. I think he calls them that, right? He's infantile. He talks about later on, he mentions it here, and later on in another book he develops it. But this evolution of consciousness, that we're still infantile, we're still immature. We're unable, like you said, there's a disassociation between persona and shadow, and we're not mature enough to embrace our shadow. We're not mature enough to embrace the anti-values that the shadow embodies, that the shadow stores. Excuse me. The shadow stores, the persona embodies. So I hope that makes some sort of sense. And the disassociation between these psychic structures, persona at the collective level and at the individual level, and shadow at the collective level and at the individual level. They're split, and there's an investment on what he calls a facade personality. I think he calls it that.
Yep.
He calls it a facade personality, which is basically the persona, the mask that we wear, the mask that society wears. George, are you a good person? Of course I'm a good person. I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
Well, what the fuck does that mean? You know what I mean? Meanwhile, I'm embezzling, right? I'm doing this and that, and no one knows, and I don't even know.
Right. Right. Well, yeah. So he says, like, as far as kind of persona and shadow go, if the individual is not if their consciousness is not developed, then they tend to identify with the persona. The ego tends to identify with the persona, right. And they tend to push the shadow underground, and it remains unconscious. So in the case that you just gave, maybe the individual would be, if somebody asks them, "Are you a good person?" "Oh yeah, I'm a great person. I'm a Christian. I volunteer," and they just see themselves. They only identify with the aspects of themselves that are in alignment with what the collective values, and they just kind of leave unconscious and forget about all of those other aspects of like, oh yeah, but he also embezzles money, and I don't know, is having an affair right now, and like those other kind of darker shadow material is not coming to the forefront in terms of the self-image, because again, maybe it's too painful to view yourself the way that you actually are in your totality. So instead, the ego identifies with the persona and pushes the shadow underground.
Yep, that's it. Yeah. But the crazy thing here, if I may, and now this is something that I'm extrapolating from this material, and part of me, if it sounds like I'm going, what's the expression? Now, I'm in left field somewhere.
Okay.
But because we say embezzlement, right? Like it's a bad word, right? But it's plausible that embezzlement can be a collective value in another context.
Right.
You know what I mean? And generosity is considered an anti-value in another context.
Right. So that's kind of what we were talking about earlier, where there is a bit of like moral relativism going on.
Exactly.
Where it's the shadow just it again, it doesn't mean that thing is objectively evil in all circumstances, but it is taboo or frowned upon in that society. So yeah,
it's scary shit. A lot of this stuff, you kind of dig into these, you swim into these waters, and you find out that some of the implications here are quite scary with regards to humanity. We can be, we are Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde simultaneously. Can you accept that? And can you live your life with that acknowledgement that you can be Mr. Hyde at any moment under certain conditions? Most people will say, what? No, I'm not. I am Dr. Hyde. I'm Dr. Jekyll. I'm not Mr. Hyde. Can you admit that? And I think that's one of the, what does he say here? We just read it earlier. In the forward, he says, we are all born with much the same human nature. It's a simple sentence, right?
Yeah.
Well, unpack that. We are all born with, that means we're all good and we're all what? Evil.
He says, we have the capacity for all of these different things. Every human is born with the capacity to be courageous, to be, compassionate, all of these things. But we also have the capacity to be envious and petty and cowardly.
And I guess this will go into what I guess next time when we talk about the new ethic. What are the implications of new ethic? I think it can be quite scary stuff. So the old ethics, like you said, it splits the persona from the shadow. Disassociates them, and it has this preference towards persona, and it constructs this what he calls this idea of perfection.
Yeah.
That only the characteristics that the collective asserts should be preferred. What's called collective, what he calls collective values. One needs to live by. One needs, and that the old ethics. One of the ways it maintains it is by what he calls discipline. In other words, it's populated with oughts, and I think he used the word oughts. Or I was brought up, thou shalt not and thou shalt do this. Shall and shall nots. You shall be generous. You shall not murder your parents.
It's like rule. That. It's rule based. Yeah.
Rule based. It's highly dogmatic. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I find that to be quite descriptive.
Right. Well, and that's kind of like what we were saying earlier with how it is, dualistic, or it's kind of works in dichotomies. The other thing you said, which I thought was really, really important to bring up, is that one of the kind of ground level truths that Neumann kind of asserts is that humans, people have been arguing, are humans born good or humans born bad? Like I think the way he thinks about it, and probably Jung too, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think the way they think about it is we are both. We are all of these things. Like the totality of us is just immense, and we contain multitudes. We contain, yes, we are nice people, but we're also shitty people, and we're also petty, and we're also selfish, and we're also compassionate and loving. And, so I think that's a good foundation to have reading all this, is to know that, I think that's how he thinks every human, what's the line from like Solzhenitsyn, that the line between good and evil runs through the heart of each individual. So, I think that's important also, as why he says kind of the old ethic doesn't really work, because we're not gods. We're not perfect. We have aspects of ourselves that are ugly, and that when we strive for perfection, what happens is those things don't just go away. They go underground, and, they get repressed, and, and then all this kind of weird stuff starts to boil up, which maybe we can start to talk about projection and scapegoat psychology.
Yeah.
As well.
And he states, perfect. Everything you said, I would agree with it. And I do also, I want to underscore that, saying everything you said is Jungian. It's very Jungian. Again, I just use Jungian as a general term because these are old ideas. This predates Jung. He just was able to articulate it. And Neumann gives credit to Jung. In this essay, if you look at the footnotes, he makes a lot of references to a particular essay found in volume 7. It's from volume 7. It's called Two Essays on Analytical Psychology. And he particularly places emphasis on the relationship between the ego and the self. It's where Jung makes a lot of he postulates a lot of his psychic structures. He postulates them in volume 5, but he develops them much more in volume 7. And Neumann makes references to this. I don't know if you look at the footnotes. And because if you read Neumann, Jungian thought permeates through this. And what I like about Neumann, well, good writers, he footnotes. His footnotes his master, his teacher. Yeah. So much of these ideas that Neumann is asserting have been postulated by Carl Jung. So and a lot what you said is Jungian. So
right.
I just want to underscore that.
Yeah, no, that's important here. Yeah, a lot of these terms like shadow and persona.
The psychic potential of being, the psychic potential of Zachness, of Georgeness, is pregnant with all possibilities. You could be a good person and a bad person. A lot depends on circumstances and ultimately your will. How will you choose? Once you're aware that you're a saint and a sinner at the same time, how will you choose to live your life? Through your thoughts, through your feelings, through your actions, how would you live your life? And again, that becomes an implication of the new ethic. Because in the old ethics, there is no will. He talks about conscience. That the old ethics employs conscience. So if I am a good person, giving a particular collective value, I go to church on Sundays. I give 5% of my salary, to these choose 2 of the 5, and if I do all that stuff, and if I wear this type of clothing, if I wear this color tie on a certain day of the week, then I'm perceived by the collective as what? As a good person, and then they'll describe me as being a conscientious person. But what's perceived as employing a conscience, as also kind of conflated with the idea of having a morality, really implies that I'm following the collective algorithms. I'm not listening to what he later called the inner voice. I'm not listening to my intuition. How can I condone war? But I do, right? By subscribing, to the enlistment, I hope that makes some sort of sense. Remember, when this country was the draft was instituted, right? A lot of people said no. These conscientious, they said no, I'm not going. They went to Canada. Well, they were scapegoated, right? They were considered as what? They were considered cowards, right?
Yeah.
And now, given another time, when there's another epoch, we realize that their voice, they were listening to their inner voice. They weren't following the collective conscience. I'm trying to. I'm also trying to develop this idea that Neumann develops, that the persona is maintained at a collective level to what we refer to as conscience. The conscience represents these collective values, and if you have a conscience, right? I mean, just think about when you go to your family for Thanksgiving. Anybody with a conscience is a good person, right? We all agree with that, right? We think it's simple. Yes, George has a conscience, but psychologically, what are they scaffolding? They're scaffolding the collective values. But if I'm against the collective values, then I don't have a good conscience.
Well, and I think, I think it's good to bring that up as well, because I had never heard I've heard the term conscience before. You even hear it in like Pinocchio. Jiminy Cricket says, like, listen to your conscience, right? Let your conscience be your guide. But the way Neumann defines conscience is, it's not, because Neumann uses two terms. He uses the term conscience and he uses the term inner voice.
Yeah.
And conscience, he thinks about as being the collective values. And inner voice, he sees as being the kind of inner voice in the individual's head, which tells them to kind of rebel against the collective values. So, in a sense, when I don't know, what's an example? When Martin Luther decided to nail the documents to the wall, he was going against his conscience, right? Because the conscience of the society was telling him to do one thing, but his inner voice was telling him to do something else. So it is a bit of a distinction, because I had always thought of the conscience as being an inner voice, as being the inner voice. But I think it is good to draw the distinction there, that at least the way that Neumann thinks about it, they're two separate things that are kind of.
That's why I think people like Jung and Neumann are so incisive, because they address these subtleties, how we are manipulated. Yes, I always thought for a long time, I would use them interchangeable. If I'm listening to my conscience, I'm listening to my inner voice. But in many ways, it's a trick by the collective, right? By what Jung calls mass men. By mom mentality. He talks about it in The Undiscovered Self, in volume 10. And Neumann differentiates these subtleties. What the group says, you're a conscientious person, Zach. What they're trying to trick you, that if you come to work on time, you punch it in at 8 and you punch out at 5, you're a very conscientious person. But if you're consistently tardy, and doesn't matter what the characteristic, the rationale is, perhaps you have to bring your daughter to school, right? And then drop off your wife. That's why you're coming to work late. But they're not interested in that. If you come to work consistently tardy and call out sick too many times, you're considered what? Someone who's not a conscientious person. Someone who doesn't care about the group's norms. You run that risk. You run the risk of being perceived that way. It may not be accurate, but that's how you be perceived. Now, I'm just giving you again a harmless example. It could be quite I can give you much more daunting examples. So showing up to work without clothes. Perhaps my inner voice told me don't wear clothes.
Yeah.
And that becomes right. And that could be quite. At one time when I was growing up, if you went to the beach without clothes, you were a criminal.
Yeah.
Unless you were in a particular location. But anyway, or if you demonstrated certain proclivities towards sexual orientations. You know what I mean? So I could build up those arguments. So he just differentiates what you and I always thought as your inner voice, as conscience. He says that no, the inner voice is this, and conscience is that. And I'm not saying he's right, but what I am saying, he is critical. And for me, it resonates. It resonates. It's how tricky, how the groups we affiliate ourselves, how they perpetuate their existence and manipulate, engineer our thoughts, feelings, and behavior through this idea of conscience. Because we all want to be perceived as someone of conscience. So implicitly, we need to subscribe to the collective values. Isn't that fucking weird? You know what I mean? If you're in a certain domain, you got to use their vocabulary, right? What happens if you don't? I mean, when I'm with my friends who love baseball, I need to use baseball jargon. If I don't, I'm considered an outcast. You follow what I'm saying? So it's I have to employ their sense of collective values. In this case, using this lexicon, using this jargon. And if I step out of it, I am considered radical. I cannot get too poetic.
Right. Well, and I think it's just by him kind of differentiating those things into two different categories, the conscience and the inner voice. You could even think about, an example where somebody's conscience is telling them one thing and their inner voice is telling them something else. Like you use the example of, I gotta leave work to drive my daughter to school. You could hear that person's self-talk as being something like, you should stay at your job and, be a good citizen. Like that's maybe the conscience. And then there's the inner voice that's saying like, yeah, but this is my daughter. This is more important than what the collective thinks. So you kind of have that, like, that would be the inner battle, essentially, would be between the conscience and the inner voice. And I think that's the kind of inner battle that he saw as being. Yeah.
He helps you begin to understand certain other phenomena. Like, for example, when in your life, you're 50 something now and you're not going to your daughter's gymnastic match. You know what I mean? Because you have to work overtime.
Right.
I mean, you're a good father if you're working overtime, right? Because that's how you pay for your daughter's gymnastics. But, at what point do you not listen to your inner voice? Because your inner voice, your conscience should be telling you, George, fuck work. Go see your daughter at the gymnastics meet, right? Because I need to maintain an intimacy with that person. I need to participate in her life, quality time. So at one point, I think Neumann gives us a vocabulary to begin looking at ourselves, honestly. When does my inner voice become split? I think he calls it what he calls it splitting something. I wrote it down somewhere. This institution of splitting. He calls it the splitting process. So when does the conscious become split from the inner voice? When are they two different strategies? They should not be, but they are. So to be a conscious person, a father does overtime to pay the extra mortgage, because he's trying to pay for the yapo and blah, 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 But sending your daughter to gymnastics, is that what she really wants, or you're concerned with your image as a good father? It brings you, it helps you become much more critical regarding your own disposition. Am I a good father? I don't know. What is a good father? Someone who works overtime and doesn't go to his daughter's gymnastic meet? I don't know. I don't want to get judgmental. We each have to decide. But doesn't those Doesn't those situations like that in life, all they do is what? They nourish anxiety, don't they?
Yeah.
You go to bed and you fill it with regret. Oh, I'm happy I'm getting the overtime, but I just missed my daughter's, she just did I don't know, a twisting, whatever you call those moves, is pirouette, double somersault. And
Yeah.
I wasn't there. I only could see a video that my wife, showed me. And that can get worse, right? Next thing you know, I'm going on this cruise that my job tells me I have to go to, and I'm not helping my wife take her parents to an assisted living that I should be doing. I should be helping her with her grieving process, but I'm not, and I'm rationalizing because I have to be this for the next promotion.
Right.
And this is the dilemma of modern man. We've developed this. This is what we call civilization. This is the results of what Neumann, again, the implications of the old ethic. We've become too urban. We become what Jung calls mass men. And I think Neumann he brings Nietzsche in, right? Talking about the ugliest man. This is when we have to become ugly.
Yeah.
When we have to violate the collective values. We need to listen to our inner voice. So how do we cultivate listening to our inner voice?
Yeah. Well, we actually, some of the other podcasts I've done, we've done Walking by Henry David Thoreau and Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And both of them talk a lot about that, cultivating their inner voice. A lot of their solution is, spending some time in solitude to kind of give yourself a little bit of distance from what the collective is constantly telling you, so you can kind of create the space to listen to your inner voice. But one other thing I definitely wanted to bring up is, Neumann talks about how the collective's values change over time by these revolutionaries listening to their inner voice. So I think that's important to see that, okay, the collective's conscience and the collective value is kind of always a little bit behind where, certain, like in his view, outstanding individuals are, and in that they're listening to their inner voice, and they're hearing the kind of next evolution, and then they're making these radical changes. They're stepping up to the status quo and saying, that's not going to fly anymore because my inner voice is telling me this. But then it's important to realize that as time goes on, the collective kind of then catches up to these individuals, and the collective's values change, and then those values become the conscious or the collective values.
It's kind of tragic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of tragic. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, cool, man. Well, maybe we can get into talking about projection in scapegoat psychology. I personally found this maybe the most interesting part, at least of this first section. So we were talking earlier about like repression, and so he says kind of one of the things that happens when we repress our shadow, we repress all these kind of like quote unquote negative aspects of our personality. There's consequences to this. It's not like it just hangs out in the unconscious and chills. Like it starts to take on a life of its own.
Yes.
And he says, all of this, when we do this, when we repress things, our unconscious starts to actually take over. And at least the way I interpret it, he's saying it's kind of runs us. Like we don't have control over it. It's almost like we're being led and run by our unconscious. And until we make these things conscious, they're going to rule our lives.
Right.
And so one of the ways that it takes over is in the form of projection. So we have all of these kind of negative things about ourselves, our shadow, and they're all floating around in our unconscious. what we need to do then, he says, is we need to personify them and we need to map them onto someone else or some, another group of people. So it's like, again, maybe you have this aspect of yourself that is cowardly and you've repressed that. So now I tend to map that onto, I don't know, the kid at school that gets picked on or something like that. That's who I then personify my own cowardice onto this other individual and project it onto him or her. So yeah, is that more or less how you think about it and read it too?
Yeah, I mean, you just explained it quite well. But I would also emphasize that, remember, projection can only happen if there's a shadow. And shadow material happens through this, particularly through repression. And again, Neumann goes into more later in the origins, the history of consciousness. But it starts quite early in life. And I think he kind of, doesn't he assert something in the book also? It starts quite early. I don't know if it's him or it's one of the Adler or Jung himself, in the forward.
Okay.
But it's, repression starts quite early. So there's a psychic structure known as the shadow that starts quite early. And it's not only repressed material, but the shadow material can also be stuff that it hasn't, what he calls it, not ripe yet. Not ripe yet. I think he calls it. I love that. It's a wonderful expression. So it's unripe psychic content. Or I prefer the term, it's dormant material. It hasn't become, it's not constellating yet. So it still exists. It basically exists at the subliminal level.
Yeah.
And that stuff, if you leave it alone, it festers, right? It gathers its own life. It gathers its own energy. And if you don't encounter it, I think he says you have to, for shadow material, he describes 3 steps. You need to recognize it, you need to acknowledge it, and then you need to integrate it, right? If you don't do that, then what's going to happen, it's going to erupt spontaneously. And that spontaneous eruption is known as projection. That is projection. So if you find a victim, an object, that for some reason, Jung calls it an image. If you find an image that for you resonates and represents, that's symbolic of a characteristic that you're unaware of, like what was the one you explained? Someone who's
I use like the weakling at school.
The weakling, okay. So you don't explain the weak, you don't encounter, you don't embrace, you don't recognize, you don't acknowledge, you don't integrate the weakling in you. You're gonna project it onto a victim somewhere.
Sure.
Okay? And it's facilitated if the collective values accept it as well.
Right.
So
in the, I was going to say the weakling example, like you could argue that's what a lot of bullies are doing. They're projecting the weakling in themselves onto this other person and beating it up. They don't like that aspect of themselves. So when they see this other person, they're projecting that onto them and they're trying to destroy it. Yeah.
Yeah, and he states that in the chapter when he talks about the old ethics, he says one of the outcomes, one of the effects of the old ethics is inferiority and guilt. Guilt, and the way we mitigate that is by finding a scapegoat.
Yeah,
we mitigate our guilts, and again, these are specific terms that broadly is referred to as neurosis. Guilt is neurosis. Inferiority is neurosis. So how do we mitigate that? Well, we project it. We say they're this, they're that. It's them. And in Neumann time, this is what the Germans did with the Jew.
Right. In not so subtle ways either, of just like
exactly.
They are the enemy. They are animals. They like everything. All of the kind of things that are going bad with the culture, everything that they kind of deem evil gets projected onto this group of people. And yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting and gets also just ramped up when we talk about these things at the collective level, right?
Yep.
Because you have the individual who is projecting their shadow onto another individual, say, but then you also have the collective, projecting their collective shadow onto the other, and you get stuff like scapegoat psychology, which is, everybody's familiar with I guess it was in the Jewish tradition where they would actually have a goat who they would then, cast all of the sins onto this goat, and then they would sacrifice the goat as a kind of symbolic way of like ridding the collective of their sins, essentially.
Yeah. According to Neumann, he gives an explanation, and I think he gives that explanation that there are two goats, right? One they kill, and then the other one they set free, and the one they kill deals with, I forget, the guilt, I think, and then the one that's set free embodies their sense of inferiorities somehow. I have to reread it. He talks about two goats, but basically that is the genesis of this idea of scapegoat. It's the goat that escapes, scapegoat, But they both, because there's two of them, right? One they kill, and you see that much more explicitly, like with the Acts text, right? When they kill someone, but the year before they celebrated, right? They're this hero, but then it's populated throughout other mythologies as well. There's people that become they're treated like kings in the tribe, but then at the end of the year there's their sacrifice, right? It makes you think of these movies. What's that movie where one night of the year you could kill anybody you want?
Oh, The Purge.
It was The Purge.
Yeah.
Very similar. That's what scapegoating is. It's a purging, right? Purging. It's a way of allowing your guilt and your sense of inferiority to be expressed, but without sacrificing your ego.
Well,
so you project it onto some sort of a victim.
Absolutely. And, there's tons of examples. I mean, the obvious ones, the Germans or the Nazis, using the Jews as the scapegoat. And sometimes he says, I think it's called mutual shadow projection, where each group is using the other as the scapegoat. So this could be like what happened in Rwanda, with the two tribes using each other as the scapegoat. Or, even in like a more subtle way, I think of like college football rivalries where it's like, Ohio State and Michigan, like Ohio State uses Michigan as the, as the devil essentially. And vice versa. So they're kind of both using each other to project their shadow material onto.
And what's beautiful about that that's what gets, for me, that's when the religious aspects gets really exciting. If you're aware of these dynamics, if you're aware that you're you said Ohio, Michigan, if you were an Ohio fan, this is what's known as fanaticism. And he talks about that in the book too, fanaticism. If you're aware of that this becomes a ritual. So it's a way for you to express your shadow material. But if you're unconscious of that, and if you're participating in that unintentionally, if it's only a sociological experience for you, it's not a religious experience for you, you're not expressing the shadow by beating up on Michigan. If you're not expressing that intentionally, then you will project it on some other person, not other Michigan fans on the Michigan football team. They don't become the scapegoats. They don't become the ritualistic scapegoats. Someone else who you do not intend to do it. So somehow it needs to be expressed, and needs to be expressed with a degree of awareness. It needs to become ritualized. But ultimately happens that these rituals lose their intensities after 3, 4, 5 generations. We no longer know the significance behind the ritual.
Right.
Therefore, we have to find a new scapegoat. And while we get that, what he calls a transitional period, during that transitional period, violence is escalated. And I would argue that's what's happening now. We don't have any more scapegoats. we don't have the what he calls the red menace, or the yellow. When he talks about Maoist China,
Mm.
and you know, what happened in Russia after 1917.
Yeah.
We don't have those scapegoats anymore. Americans don't have that. They're looking for other scapegoats now, right?
Well,
So
yeah,
they either get ultra religious, they get ultra fanatical, or they blame the immigrant. You know,
right. Well, and he said, yeah, because he talks about how, like, um, I don't know if this was an intro or the forward or where, but they're saying kind of like after the Cold War, it was like, we no longer had the Soviet Union to be our scapegoat. So like we needed to find a
red
new
menace.
scapegoat. Maybe that's China or Japan, I think they said. But the other issue I think he brings up is that like we're not just a member of one group identity. Maybe if we go back far enough into, when we were hunter gatherers, it was just like the tribe, and then maybe that other tribe could be the scapegoat. And it was very clear. Or when, religion was very dominant in Europe, maybe in like the Middle Ages, it's like, yeah, you can use your religious identity and then, maybe another religious identity would be your scapegoat. But he says what happens now is we have all of these different identities. We have our religious identity, we have our national identity, we have our ethnic identity. So within all of those, could be different scapegoats. I could be a white American Christian. So it's like, okay, well then do I choose to use another country as my scapegoat? Do I choose to use another race as my scapegoat? Do I choose to use like another political party as my scapegoat?
You're right. You're right. Any 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 scaffolding, any concretizing of identity, aka persona. Okay, how you are perceived, how you want to be perceived, or how what's the collective ideal, what's the collective perfection. I'm an American, I'm a meth fan, I'm a dad who pays his bills, whatever those personae may be. The more stronger your personae becomes, the more addicted you become to your personae, the more the disassociation, the distance between persona and shadow. And the deeper the shadow becomes forgotten, as you said earlier on, it becomes much more active at an unconscious level. Subsequently, what's going to happen is that it will be projected. So this old ethic that perpetuates the split between persona and shadow, how does it do that? Well, with repression and suppression, it also does that by developing a good conscience. What's a good conscience? Well, an American who does this, and it has these prescriptive behavior. Right. I pay my mortgage. I have, I have two Fords, one Cadillac, whatever. So you're developing this persona. So what's happening is the psychic structure known as the shadow becomes much more forgotten, therefore much more powerful, according to the assumptions of depth psychology. Okay, so that becomes much more powerful. So the old ethics nourishes the split, this association between persona and shadow. So it facilitates the projection, and the projection maintains the old ethic. And that's what we have. I think nowadays we have projections everywhere. The academics, the scientists, all you gotta do is put on the news today, and the Republicans, the Democrats, everybody is projecting their guilt and sense of superiority onto the other, to the other in some way, no matter what their names are.
Well, and that's a really good kind of
the liberals, the progressives, the conservatives. We make up these categories,
right? And that's a good kind of litmus test to see where you're probably projecting, is to see, who do I have a strong emotional reaction to negatively? Right. If it's just like Trump is the devil, okay, well, then there's probably aspects of you that you see in him, or, are projecting onto him, and same with, the Republicans and the Democrats. Like, it's a lot of, yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of projection there, and you can tell by the, you know, the amount of fanaticism you mentioned earlier. It's yeah, I think fanaticism is usually a good way to spot projection. And you know, the fanaticism can be manifested in negative and positive. You know, it can be you know,
It can be,
celebrity.
yeah, it's positive. I think, and again,
Well, positive as in like this person or this group is amazing, and you know, like this celebrity is my god, essentially. I don't mean positive as in like it's a good for you to do it, but positive in that you're projecting positive elements onto that person or identity.
yeah, yeah. But still a projection. You know,
Yeah.
This person is generous. Okay, yeah, I celebrate that person because they're generous, but I'm still not being generous. I'm still not owning my generosity. And that's problematic. If I don't own it, then I still maintain this association between persona and shadow. Ultimately, the new ethic wants you to integrate. You know, the imperative is to integrate, particularly shadow material. How do you integrate shadow material? You know, well, it's easy. The Jung says, make it much more conscious. You know, make conscious the unconscious. You know, that's his prescription, if there is one. He doesn't really say, seldom gives prescription, but if he does, that's one. Make conscious the unconscious. But how do you do that? You know, becomes the question. And I think you kind of gave a clue. That which you recognize has some sort of emotional reaction.
Yeah.
An emotional response. So yeah, and most projections, Jung he calls them technically complexes. They're emotionally, what's the word? They're embedded with emotions, and our emotions, and that's something that can contribute to awareness and ultimately discernment. To know when you're being emotional, so you can begin to withdraw projections. Because it's through projections that, again, it's challenging for me. Does projection lead to scapegoating, or does scapegoating lead to projection? I think projections lead to scapegoating, but they're inextricable ultimately, right?
Right. Yeah, they're pretty close. Yeah.
But he calls them what does Neumann call them? The scapegoats become what we call aliens. They become the minorities, right? They're the minorities and the aliens.
Well, I think it's important to talk about, so like who the popular scapegoats tend to be. He kind of gave 3 different categories, and the thing that's similar amongst all 3 of them is that they are alien. They are the other. You know,
they are.
So one of them is are minorities. One of them are I think what he calls ethically inferior. And the final category is those who are superior. So I found that really interesting. And you know, he's talking kind of at the collective level. The people who we tend to scapegoat. You know, we have the minorities. That one's pretty straightforward. You know, it could be the Jews or the African Americans in America, and you know, earlier times. So, and then the ethically inferior, these would be, I think he gives like psychopaths as being one, or you know, I guess anybody who acts unethically. Yeah. I think of somebody like Harvey Weinstein, who, you know, obviously did some things that were ethically inferior, but like, what did we do to him as a collective? Like we basically personified him as the devil, and you know, collectively
he embodies the anti-values.
He embodies he is now the scapegoat that we push all you know, ethically questionable things onto, and we sacrifice him.
And then the third category?
Oh, the third category. I thought this was really interesting. He says the superior. So he's talking about like geniuses and people of superior abilities.
Yeah.
And this is, I think this is really fascinating. And this is when you get into like why we tend to crucify celebrities. And that's a thing, right? Like we love the kind of like
the cult of personality.
Yeah, we love to kind of see the downfall of the celebrity or the person at the top, you know, whether it's like Britney Spears just having a breakdown, like there's some kind of sadistic glee that the collective gets out of.
Well, it becomes a ritual, and we recognize. I mean, right nowadays, I mean, what comes to mind very quickly is what's happening to Andrew Cuomo. You know, he embodied all these superior attributes, right?
Yeah.
But then now somehow, you know, he's fallen from grace. I'm not getting judgmental regarding the particulars. I'm addressing the phenomenon, the psychic phenomenon. There's a tendency to, you know, we make heroes, right? And he says that earlier on regarding the old ethics, that the symbol, and that's what I find that I need to chew on. And I don't think it ever hit me till I reread it. But he talks about that one of the symbols of the old ethic is the saint.
Yeah.
And the hero. And I had to think about that. I chew on that piece, and I'm still chewing on it. But I find that it's true, right? It's you know,
they're kind of the embody of perfection, or the embody.
My father's hero to me. But it's very difficult to accept. He was an anti-hero too. Maybe he had his flaws. You know, I need to accept that. You know, Humphrey Bogart is a hero to me. You know, Carl Jung is a hero to me. You know, how, you know, when will I knock these people down? Willie Mays is a hero to me. You know, Angela Davis is a hero to me. You know, when will I knock her down? Well, we'll find out, right? I guess. Right. But it serves my persona. You know.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's
according to these assumptions.
There's a funny line. It's something like "never meet your heroes," because you know it's maybe your hero is I don't know, like Billy Joel, and you find, oh, Billy Joel, you're so amazing. And you like see him in the flesh, and he's just like a real fucking asshole, and you know, maybe he's smoking, and he's just like really looks disheveled, and you're like, oh. You know, because that reality sets in like, oh, this is actually a complex human being. It's not just, you know, this God image that I have in my head. Like I'm seeing the whole thing. So I don't know. I think that probably applies to anybody, you know, that if you actually met Angela Davis, you know, you would probably get a more accurate picture of the totality of her, not just maybe the positive aspects of her.
You know, we celebrate people like, you know, a rebel without a cause, right? We celebrate these figures, you know, these, well, I think he calls them, well, not I will. He calls them black sheeps, right? These black sheep celebrate these personalities, these black sheeps. But again, they become these scapegoats, the ones we let go, you know, not the one we kill, but the one that we let go. And ritualistically, they serve our psychic needs, don't they? You know, yet they perpetuate what he calls the old ethic, which is not working, according to him.
Right. Working. Well, yeah, and maybe it's a good place to kind of leave off in anticipation of the next, because we'll get into, you know, in the next one, we'll get into Neumann's thoughts on what the new ethic should be and how we should deal with some of these issues that the old ethic creates and has created.
Sounds good.
Cool, man. Well, this was a great part one. We had some trouble, some technical issues getting started, but once we did it, it was a blast, man.
I was getting depressed, man, when I didn't think it was going to happen. So
we were stressing out. We were using Skype as our scapegoat. all
There you go. There
all
you
the
go.
negative technology experiences I've had in the last year were just pushed onto Skype, and I just wanted to sacrifice it. And
I feel like I needed to find a scapegoat and I couldn't find one.
Skype.
Applying for this.
Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend or scroll down and write us a review or give us a rating. All that helps out a ton, so thanks so much in advance. If you'd like to read along with us, please visit unpackingideas.com, where I post links to the articles and essays that we'll be reading and discussing on future podcast episodes. And finally, if you are in the New York City area, be sure to check out Jorge's Meetup. He has a meetup on Carl Jung's ideas and depth psychology, and I believe it is just called Carl Jung Meetup or Depth Psychology Meetup. Really, if you type any of those things into meetup.com search engine, if you're in the New York City area, you'll see George. All right, cool. Looking forward to part 2. We'll see you guys next episode.